On this episode of the show, I have with me Brittany Blumenthal. She's the VP of People at HiddenLayer. We're going to be talking about defining culture, a lot about working with founders and really reshaping that founder imprint. Obviously, we're trying to build a culture that's inclusive, functions within the business, but we need to worry about feedback. We need to worry about, are we a family or are we a bunch of hired guns? Have a few other things we want to talk about with Brittany, talk about some of the value that we can bring to the org as well. Hopefully we'll get everything in there. Brittany, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So I love the topic of culture. And I guess, when we're talking about it in relation to startups and working with founders, obviously love to kind of start off in just talking about that relationship. And obviously we're going to talk about within the context of culture, but working with founders and having that voice within the room when it comes to culture. Talk to us a little bit about your general experiences, maybe to start.
Yeah. So I have been at four startups where I've kind of joined either, and I guess every time reporting into a founder, all but one of those times. So, I typically come into orgs when they are, kind of 30 to 40 people and getting ready to kind of hit that first real phase of growth. So usually we're talking about going from 40 to 100 in the course of, 12 to 18 months. And I think founders are generally have created a really good idea. They've got a product that they care about. They've kind of built their initial team around them, the people that they trust and think that they're going to be able to, get this product into the market and really make an impact. And I would say founders and CEOs, I do generally see understand the value of culture at a high level, but I think they generally need some, I guess, kind of coaching on what that actually means and how that actually shows up within an organization. So, culture is a buzzword, and I always tell people like there's a reason why we don't necessarily care about, but we obsess over culture because most of these businesses in the tech world are driven by the people who work here. So most of them have, biggest expenses can be payroll, and the success or the failure of the company is largely driven by the people that we're able to hire and, the people that we're able to obtain, retain, which is also very important. So I kind of kick off my conversations in these first, 30 days with founders, and I say, the best way to retain talent and to be able to bring in the right people that are going to be the most successful here is to be very clear and very, very true about what it's like to work here and who we're looking for and how we're going to show up today. So I always try to get them to put pen to paper on what the culture is today and kind of where we're going with the understanding that it's going to change along the way. But the best way that we can keep what we have now if it's good or change what we want to change because it's not working for us is to really be thoughtful about what that is and write it down.
Absolutely. So when it comes to culture, I do feel in startups, there is a component of where a people or talent leader comes in at what stage and how much or how strong the founder's imprint is. And by that, I mean how much the views of the founder, obviously their views are going to be the first thing the company shapes around. But those are also sometimes centered around business drivers, technology drivers, a lot of different things that might not be what a people or talent leader prioritize in how they view culture. I guess there might be this differing view of what that culture should be. And when you come into these startups, talk to us about that founder imprint, right? And maybe depending on that relationship with the founder, how you start working with them to have them actually understand that they have imprinted their views on the company and that it could be maybe a little bit too focused on from their lens of the world.
Yeah. So I mean that's definitely true. There's a reason that you hear the term all the time. It starts from the top. Like the culture really does start from the top. And I even talk to my mid-level managers about that. Your team is looking to you on how, what your attitude is and how you're approaching things. And they're really like trying to mold into that. So I think that is especially true when you're talking about a founder or a CEO. I think one thing that I always do, kind of in preparation for this, is I do, which is very common in kind of like the people leader world, is I come in and do a little bit of a roadshow with the individual contributors and other managers and people who are new and have been there for a while, and try to get from them like what is the culture actually like today? What do they love about working there? What could they change? keeps them up at night, like all of those things. And a lot of times those are like business product things, but you can always kind of see them come out in the culture statement. So so that's kind of part one. So I like to take that back to the founding team and say, hey, here's what your team is saying about you. And a lot of times they're surprised by that, and sometimes they're not so surprised by that. But I think that, a thing that where people leaders can really fail is when they say, okay, this is what your culture is, and this is what we need to change it to. Because if there's one person driving a culture change, that is not going to be successful. You have to be on the same page with the founding team on how they want to run the company. And, I think a big part of this and something that I found incredible value in doing this kind of exercise is your culture doesn't always have to be this like bright, fuzzy, world that maybe you see when you think about like all the perks that Google has or all the, like you also have to be rooted in the business reality of the type of business that you're creating, the type of founders that you have. And I think, what your definition of what an incredible culture is may not be the same as mine. And the way that you really get this kind of like bad culture vibe in a company is when you say one thing, but you actually operate the other way. So I actually really advocate for let's have an honest conversation about how we expect people to show up. And then let's be honest about that in the interview process when people are here. Let's pull that into how we think about career development and promotions. And let's make sure that the culture that we say we want is how we actually show up to the org, both as leaders, as people managers, as individual contributors, and we like really integrate it into everything that we do. So, an example of that, which you mentioned earlier, is like so I generally will do this exercise, and I guess I'll give you that really quick. So I'll do this exercise with our founding team, and then if it's more than one person, and then I'll do it with the executive team or leadership team, whatever kind of like that group looks like at the time. And we'll create a bunch of different kind of topics, and then ask all of the people in the room to place a dot along the line of the spectrum of where they fall on that spectrum. So it's meant to be like two very opposite, very kind of like harsh ends of it. And the one that you mentioned earlier was, we are a family here, which is one end of it. So if you think about your family, you'll do anything for them. You're always going to be there for them and try to help them get there. You're probably never going to give up on those people, no matter how much they challenge you. And then the other end of the spectrum is like we're a professional sports team. If you make a couple of mistakes, you're out. If you don't show up to play, you're out. Like everybody's replaceable. We'll find somebody else that could do the job. And so getting people to decide, where they fall on that spectrum helps create a lot of this discussion around how we want to show up. So, I always tell people try not to put your dot in the middle, try to lean one way or another. And you'll see where there are some really passionate people on one end of the spectrum or other, and it creates a lot of good conversation. The idea is, you leave that exercise with alignment on where we fall on each of these things, and then you can really draft a culture statement from there. you know, Working in one other thing I'll say about that is like working in tech, I've worked for a lot of CEOs that are very, the number of hours you work matters most. And then I've also worked in places where it's, you make your schedule, you show up to meetings that you are critical in, but otherwise like work when you work best. And both of those things, you can have success in both of those cultures, but you can't have success if your founding team or your CEO is saying, the number of hours that you work matter. And what we're telling the team is that no, we're this flexible, fun work environment. Like the best thing that you can do for your team and your company is to be honest about what the culture is and how you expect them to show up. And that's going to get you much further than trying to create this like fake culture because the world and LinkedIn and articles tell you that that's what's going to be successful.
Maybe unpack a few things there. I really like how you said how we want you to show up. I think that's actually, I haven't heard it phrased that way. I actually, if we were going to philosophically look at it, I don't like the word culture because I think a lot of times culture is a misnomer for how a company wants you to operate, show up, behave, the rules that they think favor them. And I think the way you phrased it is how we want you to show up. Trust, feeling safe and open and being able to make a mistake and understand that there is amount of understanding, obviously depending on the mistake. But generally speaking, it's a safe space to work. I think that is that environment. I think sometimes we try to find this culture and that contract that exists between what the company wants and what the employee wants. And that contract is this culture. That's how I view it. I view it as we start defining the rules of engagement, as it were. And I think the way you mentioned it as how we want to show up, and as a family, there's certain expectations we would want within that contract from our employees, but also then the employees, right? I think maybe the one thing that we don't talk about enough on this topics from an employee's perspective, this term culture, this how I view it, this contract that exists of how we operate with each other, they always don't believe what's being said will actually be what's done. Because in the end, they go, well, if I do make a mistake, is that going to mean a performance review is going to be a ding because the company thinks this way, but my manager really controls my outcome, my success. If you were thinking about culture from purely an employee perspective and what they want and what they are hoping to achieve in their goals, talk to us a little bit about from that perspective.
Yeah, so one thing I'll say is it's not like, if you go to six employees in any organization, they're going to have a different kind of take on how they would want the culture to be in an ideal world.
Yep.
So again, it kind of comes back to like, let's just be honest about what it is and let's let people opt in and opt out. And then let's like model all of the policies and the practices and the way that we lead around that. So, an example of that, to go back to your point on like, if we decided one of the lines that I use is like we take risks. So, calculated risks are encouraged, those things are rewarded, occasional failure is expected, that's not punished, or we play it safe. Risks should be avoided or minimized at all costs, and failure is, concerning or problematic. Like those are two different cultures. And like having those different cultures are going to create different like types of behaviors from the team. So I would say that if you're going to be one of those kind of take risk people, like we want, and I would say most tech companies they know that there's going to be big risks that they take, and sometimes those things are going to pay off, and sometimes they're going to fall flat. But it's really about, at least what we say at HiddenLayer is like it's about what you learn from it. So and then so we pull that into everything we do. When we do performance reviews, like we ask people to, what is something that you're the most proud of from this, last quarter, and what's something that you learned or a mistake that you made that, and because it's really about like reflecting on those mistakes and making sure that they don't happen again. So that would probably be a scenario where it's like, okay, like you made this mistake, you're making it again, you're making it again. Like that's not really taking risks. That's making mistakes. So it's really just pulling, whatever the big tenets of your culture are into things like performance management or the way that you give feedback. Something that's also kind of interconnected to this kind of culture, definition and defining your own company's culture are, values or key behaviors. So I lean towards key behaviors instead of values. I think values are kind of like feel very corporate, and key behaviors are more of like, terms like this is, so we'll do a little like, it's more of like a phrase. And then we explain what that actually looks like in practice. And that kind of all interconnects with the culture. Like we expect you to take risks, and here's what that looks like. And then, you can pull that into performance management or promotion eligibility and things like that. So it all feels very sincere because it shows up in more than just this document that your executive team wrote and gave you one time.
I like that a lot. You mentioned feedback, and obviously culture, as it were, as we're talking about. Without that feedback, it's hard for somebody to know when they're deviating from. I guess when you look at, you know, uh, building a culture, but also a culture of feedback, so that you can actually incorporate not just in one direction, I need to see these adjustments, but the other side, where actually you're taking feedback on, as you said, we could have 10 employees and all 10 will view culture differently, but having an outlet to take that feedback on, I think, is important. I guess when you look at it, when you look at feedback and trying to make sure that there's an environment of communication that's bi-directional, how do you help support the employee feedback loop back into this process?
So we have what I found to work to be the most successful, I guess, way to actually create a true culture of feedback is like I kind of keep saying this, but to integrate it into so many parts of the way that we show up every day. So, we just did a company-wide offsite last week. I sent out a feedback form immediately on, Monday to make sure that we were capturing feedback and people were able to give us, thoughtful feedback when it was still in their minds. We tend to do all of these surveys anonymously. I just think we get more honest feedback that way. So we will do those throughout the year. You know, we do the engagement surveys. I do think those are important. I think they have to be done right. They have to be followed up on. And then we train I believe in training our both our management team and our individual contributors on, ways to give feedback effectively. So, we just do, at my current company and companies prior, I've run these things that we call manager pods, which the topics vary, and we have like one kind of focus area each month. So we did a feedback session on that, and when's the right time to give feedback? How do you get buy-in to give feedback? Those types of things. And then we're coming up on, part of our review process is peer feedback, and so we're doing a training next month on how to ask good questions to get good feedback, and then also how to give good feedback and make it impactful and things like that. So, the company I think has to figure out how do they want to give feedback. One of the things that I have again in this kind of culture exercise is like we give feedback immediately, or we're more of like a culture that waits until that performance review process. And like, you're going to hear giving feedback immediately is better, and that's fine. But if you're not a culture that's currently doing that, then you don't need to say that you're doing that. Again, this is one of those things where it's a living and breathing document. So if you strive to be that culture, but realistically you're getting feedback and performance reviews, then you can update that as you go, and you could build like policies and processes and trainings and support to get to that place. But yeah, I think it's like you've got to, it's got to also be upward feedback has to be, there's got to be an option for that. I tell all my managers, like when you're giving feedback in your one-on-ones, ask them for feedback. And again, ask specific questions, not just like, do you have any feedback for me? Because people shut down. It's got to be top down, but also bottoms up for it to really be a culture of feedback and for people to really feel comfortable giving you feedback.
I've noticed, and obviously I've heard you talk about how embedded you make everything across the org. There's intentionality behind things you do to ensure the culture is bi-directional. You meant, obviously being a living document and being able to evolve, and obviously, working with, both, top down, but also making, managers who are having to carry this out aware of their role. I guess when you see, we've been talking about how to improve culture, and I guess maybe it'd be fair to just ask you, when things are not going well, when you walk into an environment where you can sense that everyone has a different view of culture and everyone has a different way of seeing culture top down, even because there hasn't been something put in place, and there is a little bit of work in that regard you have to do as a VP of people, as a people leader. How would you come into that situation and address that? And obviously, I know there's a lot of process stuff, but maybe more from the human side, right? How do you come in and ensure that people can see that things will be changing? Because obviously, you mentioned if you say one thing and you do or show something else, that undermines culture. How do you work to remedy that particular situation?
The first thing I would say is A, you have to get in front of it and communicate it. So, in the past, I've rolled out, like I keep calling it a document, but that is essentially what it is. Is like we get an output of like, here's what we decided the culture is going to be and how we're going to show up every day. And then we'll call out, kind of proactively, like, this is a shift for us. At my last company, that was, we decided that we were going to be more transparent with the team than we had been before. We're getting a lot of questions on runway and funding and deal size and things like that that our former leadership hadn't really wanted to share, and we made that change. So we said, hey, here's an update to the culture document. Like we're making the shift here. It's probably going to take us about 6 months. Like we had to clear up a bunch of reporting and things like that. So walking people through that and then following up on it. I'm just a big believer in calendar reminders. Like I said, in 3 months this thing was going to get done, and so I'll put it on our agenda for our next all hands and say, 3 months ago we met, we said we were going to do this. Here's the progress that we've made towards it. And people understand that, especially in the startups, like things happen and, priorities shift. And sometimes knock something out of the park and other times it gets deprioritized. But I find just talking about it goes a long way. And I think it's also, creating mechanisms for people to be able to say, it seems like you see it this way, but that's not how I see it. And I think a lot of like the engagement surveys are really helpful for that. We just ran one, and a big thing that came up was lack of clarity around career development. And we put a lot of emphasis on that. Like we want, we think about, we're not, what we've decided as a company, that we're not going to be one of those places that like brings people in and burns them out in 2 years, but it's like, that's fine. We can replace that person and get somebody else. And I know a lot of companies do that, and we're much more, trying to be thoughtful about long-term career development and promotions and things like that. So it's like, okay, that's something that, clearly doesn't feel like it's a true part of our culture, and we've committed to changing that. So I think you just have to be honest. Like people, that's all people want to know is you're doing something. And even if it feels insincere right now, at least you have the awareness that there's a gap to close here and you're working towards closing it.
I love that. To be honest with you, I think that's great advice. And maybe final question: when you are at a startup and you're trying to, if it's early stage, obviously this might be more relevant. You need the founders to see the value, because obviously they're busy a million miles an hour, a million directions. Yeah, they have to see the value to stop and go, okay, we need to put this in place, because if they're gonna grow, it's gonna be harder. At 20 people versus 120 people, there's gonna be a very different way of handling this conversation we've been having. How do you stop a founder, not physically, but getting them to slow down and realize that they need to be a partner in this process with you? And I'm not saying founders aren't. I'm saying in the case where you're coming in and it's early stage and it's those early days and you want to put the foundation in. How do you make them understand the value of putting in the culture and documenting the way you've been mentioning it?
So I've experienced both sides of it, where they were super into it and yeah, let's prioritize this and get this done immediately. And then another side of it, which is, it's too early. We have a culture here that works. Like I don't want to change anything. So in the second scenario, like I don't want to prioritize this right now. I did the exercise a little bit on my own. Like I took it to a few different leaders, and especially places that in my listening tour from those first 30 days, there seemed to be disparate, like differing type, I guess, opinions between between different orgs. So that's something that you'll see a lot, especially in these like fully remote companies, is, the sales org operates one way and the, engineering org operates another way. And like, that's a recipe for disaster as you scale. So, I kind of identified, here's a couple of places that I'm getting differing opinions between different groups, but maybe there's some consistency within the group. And then I took those that kind of same exercise on a very lighter scale to those leaders. And so being able to kind of call out like, hey, this person that's running this org feels really strongly that we are, going to have a decision-making process of consensus, and this person is telling their team that we have a decision-making like consensus that or decision-making process that's top down, and kind of like being able to show the challenges that could come from that. I will, even just from that 30-day listening tour, I'll write out a culture statement, like a very light one on here's what I'm hearing. And a lot of times I'll take that back to the founder and I'll say, hey, here's how your org says that it is to work here, but you've told me that it's actually XYZ. So, if you continue down this path, like you're going to take these 30 people to 130 people that are operating in a way that like isn't aligned with what you want to operate. So we've got to prioritize this work. That would be my advice.
I love it. Brittany, thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts on this. We covered a lot of ground and you gave us lots of tips, insights, examples. So I appreciate it. If somebody does want to reach out to you to further the conversation, pick your brain on something you mentioned, what is a good way of connecting?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn's probably the best way. My LinkedIn is / Brittany Barnes HR. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, so I will get any messages there.
Okay, fantastic. We'll make sure to include that. Again, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this show. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, we talked to Brittany about culture. We talked about working with early stage founders, changing the culture, adjusting the culture, improving the culture. We talked about culture being a living document, and also include some conversation around feedback. I think Brittany covered a lot of ground, so please share this episode with somebody else. I was thinking we might cover less, but I was really glad that we covered as much as we did, and I think there's a lot of value, so please do share this episode. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you, and goodbye.